July 28, 1942, Moscow. The air in the Kremlin is heavy, saturated with the smell of cheap tobacco and the cold sweat of panicked generals. Joseph Stalin leans over a desk, the flickering light of a lamp carving deep shadows into his face. The men are soot-stained, their eyes hollow from weeks of retreating before the German panzers. The officer unfolds the paper. He begins to read, "Order of the People's Commissar of Defense of the USSR." Then the sentence that would turn men into legends or corpses, and I shall go nazad. Not a step back. There's only the enemy in front and the executioner behind. The summer of 1942 was perhaps the darkest hour in the history of the Soviet Union. While the world's attention had been fixed on the defense of Moscow the previous winter, the German High Command had shifted its gaze south. Adolf Hitler, obsessed with the economic strangulation of the USSR, launched Operation Blue, Fall Blau. The objective was staggering in its ambition, a massive two-pronged offensive designed to seize the industrial heart of the Donbass, cross the Don River, and capture the oil fields of the Caucasus. If the oil was cut off, the Soviet war machine would seize up and die on the vine. The German Wehrmacht, specifically Army Group South, moved with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. General Friedrich Paulus' 6th Army and Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army spearheaded the drive across the open steppes. The terrain was a tanker's dream, flat, dry, and devoid of natural obstacles. Soviet formations, still reeling from the disastrous defeat at Kharkov in May, found themselves unable to anchor a defensive line. Divisions were bypassed, encircled, and ground into the dust by the Luftwaffe and the relentless grinding of panzer treads. By July, the front had effectively collapsed. Thousands of Red Army soldiers were surrendering, while others simply discarded their weapons and began a disorganized retreat toward the east, hoping to outrun the steel tide. In Moscow, the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, watched the maps with growing horror. The retreat was no longer tactical. It was becoming a contagion of panic. Every mile surrendered brought the Germans closer to the Volga River, the primary artery for Soviet transport and the symbolic gateway to the east. At the center of this path lay Stalingrad, a city stretching 20 miles along the riverbank, bearing the name of the Soviet leader himself. If Stalingrad fell, the Volga would be severed, and the southern front would be lost entirely. The Soviet leadership realized that traditional military discipline had failed. The Great Retreat was threatening the very existence of the state. It was against this backdrop of impending catastrophe that Stalin decided the time for professional military maneuvering had ended, and the time for absolute state-mandated terror had begun. The atmospheric weight of July 1942 was not just measured in the soaring heat of the steppes, but in a profound crisis of morale that threatened to dissolve the Red Army from within. Since the German invasion began in June 1941, the Soviet Union had lost millions of men to encirclement and capture. By the time the Wehrmacht reached the bend of the Don River, a dangerous sentiment had begun to spread among the rank and file. The Soviet Union was too vast to be conquered, and therefore one could always retreat further into its endless interior. This geographical fatalism was, in Stalin's eyes, a death sentence for the nation. The retreating soldiers weren't just moving east. They were abandoning the very agricultural and industrial zones, the grain of the Kuban and the factories of the Don that kept the Red Army alive. As the 6th Army closed within striking distance of the Volga, the Soviet 62nd and 64th Armies were tasked with the impossible, stopping a force that had not yet been stopped. The disorganized retreat had created a vacuum of authority. Units were losing contact with their commanders, and panic mongers were reportedly spreading rumors that the government had already fled Moscow. Stalin understood that the survival of the Soviet system depended on a psychological shock. He needed to transform the retreat into a stationary war of attrition. He needed every soldier to understand that the Volga was not just a river, but a cliff edge. On July 28, 1942, the shock arrived in the form of Order No. 227. It was a brutal piece of prose, stripped of the usual Marxist-Leninist jargon and replaced with a raw, emotional appeal to the motherland's survival, backed by the threat of immediate execution. The execution of Order No. 227 can be understood through the leadership angle of Stalin's cold pragmatism and the tactical angle of the newly formed iron structures. From the leadership perspective, Order 227 was Stalin's admission that the Red Army was on the verge of total dissolution. He did not couch the order in heroic glory. He spoke of the shame of losing territory by stating that the Soviet Union was smaller than people thought, and that not a step back was the only way to save the state. He effectively tied the life of every soldier to the square meter of earth beneath his boots. This was leadership by existential ultimatum. Stalin was betting that the fear of the NKVD behind would eventually be eclipsed by a fanatical, defensive rage against the invader in front. From the tactical angle, the order introduced a terrifying new layer to the battlefield: the blocking detachments and penal battalions. Tactically, the blocking detachments were not meant to engage the Germans, but to act as a hard stop for their own retreating troops. Positioned in the immediate rear, they were equipped with machine guns to stop unauthorized withdrawals, by force if necessary. Meanwhile, the Strafbats penal battalions became the Army's disposable force. These units, composed of disgraced officers and soldiers, were sent into minefields or tasked with capturing heavily fortified German strongpoints to trigger enemy fire and reveal their positions. This tactical ruthlessness turned the Soviet defensive line into a rigid, unbreakable machine. If a position was lost, the survivors were often not welcomed back. They were interrogated, and if found to have retreated without a written order, they were either executed on the spot or sent to atone with blood in the next suicidal assault. The true impact of not a step back is best viewed through the human angle of the common infantryman and the enemy angle of the bewildered German commanders. For the average Soviet, even Order No. 227 was a psychological sledgehammer. It stripped away the last remnants of the retreat-to-save-the-force mentality. The soldiers knew that the NKVD was no longer a distant threat in the rear. They were a present reality, often just hundreds of meters behind the front. Yet, strangely, many memoirs from the time suggest the order provided a grim sense of relief. It ended the uncertainty by making the Volga the final line of existence. The order simplified the soldier's world to a single, brutal binary: kill the enemy or die where you stand. This created a transformation where men, having accepted their own deaths, fought with a nihilistic ferocity that shocked even the most veteran German units. From the enemy angle, the German Sixth Army began to notice a chilling shift in the nature of the war. General Friedrich Paulus and his officers, accustomed to the sweeping encirclements of 1941 where thousands of Soviets would surrender once their flanks were turned, now encountered islands of resistance that refused to surrender even when completely cut off. The Germans began to record instances of Soviet squads fighting to the last man in insignificant basements or grain silos. The Wehrmacht's tactical doctrine, based on Begangungskrieg, maneuver warfare, began to grind to a halt. They realized they were no longer fighting an army that sought to survive. They were fighting an army that had been ordered to become part of the rubble. The German soldiers coined a term for this new, claustrophobic nightmare: Rattenkrieg, or Rat War, where every sewer and cellar became a fortress. This clash of psychological extremes turned the ruins of Stalingrad into a meat grinder. The Germans held the technological advantage and air superiority, but the Soviet soldiers, governed by the absolute mandate of Order 227, held the moral advantage of having no choice. This created a tactical stalemate in the city streets where the distance between the two front lines was often measured in the thickness of a single brick wall. As autumn approached and the ruins of the city began to smoke under constant bombardment, the legend of the unbreakable Soviet defender began to take physical shape in the debris of the Barricadi and Red October factories. The ultimate test of Order No. 227 arrived on September 14, 1942. This was the day the German 71st and 295th Infantry Divisions finally broke into the heart of Stalingrad, reaching the nail of the city, the central railway station, and the Memev-Kurgan Hill. The 62nd Army under General Vasily Chukov was on the verge of being pushed into the Volga. The Germans could see the river. They were less than 800 meters from the primary ferry landings. Had the Soviet units followed the logic of the previous summer, they would have abandoned the West Bank to preserve their remaining strength. But the specter of not a step back loomed over every commander. To retreat across the river was to face the NKVD firing squads. To stay was to face the German panzers. They chose to stay. In a desperate gamble to plug the gap, the 13th Guards Rifle Division, led by General Alexander Rodimtsov, was ordered to cross the Volga under the cover of night. They moved across the water in open barges, under a sky lit by German flares and a rain of Junkers Ru-87 Stuka dive bombers. The crossing was a massacre. The water of the Volga churned with the impact of shells and the blood of the men within. Despite the carnage, the survivors scrambled onto the oil-slicked banks and immediately charged into the ruins of the central station. There was no time for organization, no room for maneuvers. This was the moment the command became reality. Rodimtsov's men engaged in a 3-day battle for the station that saw the building change hands 15 times. Men fought with bayonets, sharpened shovels, and bare hands in the smoke-filled hallways. By the time the dust settled, only 320 men of the original 10,000 in the division remained uninjured, but the German momentum had been shattered. They had been stopped on the very threshold of the river. The defiance mandated by Order No. 227 soon crystallized into specific points of legendary resistance that defied military logic. By October, the 62nd Army had been pushed into 3 narrow bridgeheads along the river, some only a few hundred meters deep. In this suffocating space, the concept of not a step back transformed from a threat of execution into a tactical doctrine of hugging the enemy. General Chukov ordered his troops to stay so close to the German lines that the Luftwaffe could not bomb the Soviets without hitting their own men. This turned the entire city into a series of disconnected, brutal skirmishes where the command was upheld in every basement and attic. The most famous manifestation of this was Pavlov's house. A small platoon led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov seized a 4-story apartment building that overlooked a key square. Following the absolute directive of the Stavka, they turned the house into a fortress. They mined the approaches, smashed holes in the walls for machine gun nests, and held the position for 58 days against constant infantry and tank assaults. On German maps, the building was marked as a festing fortress, but in reality, it was just a handful of men who refused to move because the land beyond the Volga no longer existed for them. Similar scenes played out at the grain elevator, where a few dozen Soviet Marines held off an entire German battalion for days, fighting floor by floor, until they ran out of ammunition, water, and finally, life. The turning point was not a single explosion or a grand maneuver, but the cumulative exhaustion of the German 6th Army. For every meter they gained, they paid in blood and time they did not have. By November, the German offensive had lost its punch. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht were physically and psychologically broken by an enemy that, according to their training, should have surrendered weeks ago. The rigid adherence to Order 227 had forced the Germans into a war of attrition they were not equipped to win. While the 62nd Army held the ruins, the Soviet High Command was quietly assembling a massive pincer force on the flanks, a counteroffensive made possible only because the men in Stalingrad had stood their ground until the very end. The immediate consequence of Order No. 227 was a staggering, visceral cost in human life that is difficult to process by modern standards. Between August and October 1942, the official records of the NKVD show that over 13,000 soldiers were executed under the authority of the Not a Step Back decree. These were men deemed cowards or traitors for retreating or failing to hold an assigned position. Tens of thousands more were stripped of their rank and sent to the Strafbats, penal battalions. In these units, the mortality rate often approached 90%, as they were used to clear minefields by walking through them, or to draw enemy fire during the most dangerous reconnaissance missions. The statistical reality was clear. Stalin had traded the lives of tens of thousands of his own men to ensure the compliance of millions. However, the strategic shift was undeniable. The order had successfully cauterized the wound of the Great Retreat. By the time the German Sixth Army was fully committed to the street fighting in Stalingrad, they were no longer facing a crumbling rabble, but a disciplined, fanatical wall of infantry. The rigid defense of the city meant that the German front line became a jagged, static mess, draining the Wehrmacht's reserves. This allowed the Soviet High Command, led by Marshals Zhukov and Vasilevsky, to secretively gather a massive force of over 1 million men on the flanks of the city. While the defenders in the ruins were following the not-a-step-back order to the letter, the Soviet war machine was preparing for Operation Uranus, the great encirclement that would trap 300,000 German soldiers in the very city they had tried to conquer. The echoes of Order No. 227 reverberated far beyond the smoking ruins of the Volga. When the German Sixth Army was finally forced to surrender in February 1943, the world witnessed the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht in the field. The not-a-step-back order had achieved the impossible. It had held the line long enough for the strategic momentum of the entire Second World War to shift. From the perspective of military psychology, Stalingrad became a graveyard not just for German soldiers, but for the myth of German invincibility. The ruthless discipline imposed by Stalin had successfully transformed a retreating army into an offensive juggernaut. That would not stop until it reached the gates of the Reichstag in Berlin. However, the legacy of the order remains one of the most controversial chapters of the war. While Soviet propaganda later sanitized the defense of Stalingrad as a purely heroic, voluntary sacrifice, the opening of the archives in the 1990s revealed the darker machinery of the state. The blocking detachments were a physical manifestation of a regime that valued the ground more than the men who stood upon it. Yet, even among the survivors, there was a complex recognition of the order's necessity. Many veterans later admitted that in the chaos of 1942, without the iron hand of Order 227, the front might have disintegrated entirely. The order had forced a collective courage upon men who were pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, creating a legend of resistance that would define the Soviet identity for decades to come. The One Command had effectively turned the 62nd Army into a living shield. By the time the bells of victory rang in Moscow, the survivors of Stalingrad were no longer just soldiers. They were icons of a new kind of warfare where the will to survive was synonymous with the will to remain stationary. The city itself was awarded the title of Hero City, but the cost of that title was written in the nameless graves of those who had retreated a step too far and faced the grim justice of their own side. The machinery of Not a Step Back was gradually dismantled as the Red Army moved into Europe, but its shadow remained, a reminder of the absolute price of total war. Order No. 227 remains one of the most chilling documents in the history of human conflict. It stands as a testament to a moment in time when a nation's survival was balanced on the tip of a bayonet and the edge of a firing squad. To look back at the defense of Stalingrad is to witness the ultimate collision between state-mandated terror and individual resilience. While the order was born from the cold, calculating mind of Joseph Stalin, its execution fell upon the shoulders of ordinary men who were forced to find a level of courage that should not be asked of any human being. The legend of the Not a Step Back directive is not found in the ink of the decree, but in the dust of the grain elevator and the blood-stained banks of the Volga. It asks a haunting question that continues to echo through military history. Can a soldier truly become a legend if his bravery is compelled by the threat of execution? The answer lies in the ruins of the city itself. The men of the 62nd Army did more than just obey a command. They internalized a grim reality. They fought with a tenacity that transcended the fear of the NKVD, turning the very debris of their homes into a fortress that the most powerful army in the world could not break. Ultimately, Order No. 227 was the pivot upon which the Second World War turned. It was the moment the Great Retreat ended and the long, bloody road to Berlin began. It reminds us that in the darkest hours of total war, the line between hero and victim becomes impossibly thin. The One Command didn't just turn men into legends, It forged a legacy of endurance that redefined the limits of what a person can withstand when they are told that, for them, the world ends exactly where they stand.